So ever since I posted my last video about the GAMSAT, I have been bombarded by questions from fans saying, do another GAMSAT video and write an essay for us. I want to see your structure. How are you so brilliant? Just so many comments, and I'm kind of now just like, fine, I'll do it. I will film another video for you guys showing you exactly how to write an essay for the GAMSAT, or at least how I write my essays. All right, I mean, twist my arm. Fine, I'll do it. I'll do it. And I'm like, okay, fine, I guess. I mean, I'll do it. I'll do it. Come on.
A hard time if your motion is still. Then you move some things around because the lyrics is ill.
So welcome back to the channel, guys. My name is Kate Robson, and a couple weeks ago now I posted my first proper video about how I scored 80 in section 2 of the GAMSAT. For those who don't know, the GAMSAT is the famous test that gets you into medical school in Australia and a couple of other countries that use it. And it's split up into 3 sections. Section 1 is reading comprehension. Section 2, which is the one that I'm focusing on because that's the one I did the best in, you have to write 2 essays. The first one is task A, the second is task B. Task A is kind of like, plays into socio-political issues, contemporary society stuff like class, race, power, history, science, that sort of thing, all of our kind of non-fiction stuff. And then task B is kind of plays more into personal issues, personal stuff, growth, identity, that sort of thing. So I plan on making 2 videos in this series, both about and showing you how I write my essays for the GAMSAT using actual essays that I've written and have got marked that have both scored over 80. This video is going to be showing you how to do a task A essay, and the next one will be about showing you how to do a task B essay. Make sure you watch both of them because they'll both really help you. Task B is kind of my stronger one, so I would recommend that one as well. And if you haven't seen my first video about how I scored 80 in section 2 of the GAMSAT, make sure you watch that one right here, because that'll tell you everything you need to know. Preparation, exam day tips, just all of my tips all in one video. So yeah, make sure you check that one out. In this video, I'm gonna show you guys one of the essays that I actually wrote in preparation for my GAMSAT, which scored an 85 for task A. I got it marked by an actual tutor that I had access to at the time, and he gave me an 85. Since that mark, I've edited it using his suggestions, so it may even be better than an 85, or maybe I've messed it up and made it worse, but it's definitely sitting somewhere around the mid to low 80s, which will put you in the top 1% for an essay like that for section 2. This essay is on the topic of violence and kind of the antidote to violence. I couldn't find all of the prompts that I responded to, but I wrote down one of the prompts that I specifically responded to. When you're responding to prompts, I really suggest that you look through all of the prompts and you kind of try to find the underlying theme of all of them, not just one of them, because it kind of is a reductive approach to do that. To, you know, have 5 brilliant prompts, brilliant quotes from brilliant people, and then just use one of them seems like a bit of a waste. I sort of did that in this essay because it was very early on in my preparation. I think it was actually like my first essay that I wrote. But yeah, I would really suggest going through all the prompts and trying to figure out an idea that way. If you guys want me as well to post another video where I look at all the prompts, try and analyze them, deduce what they're saying, please let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to do that because I know that in my preparation, that was the hardest thing that I found to do, was like actually coming up with an idea. So let me know if you guys want to see that. Anyway, yeah, so this one is to do with violence, specifically antidotes to violence and how we can solve the problem of violence. And with task A essays, I usually write an argumentative style essay just because I think they kind of play into the themes of the prompts a little bit better. You can write a reflective or creative or whatever you want to on task A, it's really up to you. But what I found worked for me was an argumentative for task A and a reflective / personal one for task B. In saying that, with argumentative essays, I used the structure of intro, body, body, conclusion. So I had 4 paragraphs all up with 2 body paragraphs. You don't have to do that. You can use 3 body paragraphs if you want to. I just found that I liked that style a little bit more because I liked interweaving my counter arguments within my body paragraphs and coming up with counter arguments for each of them within there. But I've heard lots of people do intro, body, counter argument paragraph, and then conclusion. It's really up to you what you want to do. Also, a little disclaimer, remember this is just how I write my essays. You don't have to do the same thing. Perhaps you have an even better style that you want to use. Feel free to go use that and maybe even share it with other people, with me. I'd be really interested to know. You can pop that stuff down in the comments section and start a discussion about what kind of structures you like the best, why you think that structure works, why you think my structure works, or maybe it doesn't. Feel free to let me know. I would love to hear that kind of stuff because I will be taking the GAMSAT again next year, so anything helps. So just an overview as well, with my tone for my essays, I always actually go for slightly informal, more on the formal side than informal. If it was a spectrum of formal and informal, it'd probably like be up here somewhere, but I do like chucking in a couple of rhetorical questions in all of my essays, some short punchy sentences to really capture the reader's attention. So not always like long detailed sentences, but incorporating short punchy sentences that are slightly more informal with longer detailed formal sentences to have a nice balance, just to try and make it a nice read for the marker. All right, so let's get stuck into it. So we'll start with the introduction. For all of my introductions, I use pretty much a similar structure. So I go hook, context, thesis, and then limitations. You don't have to use this structure again, but I kind of found this one worked for me. So if we look over to my computer screen now, first of all, we've got the quote up here. So the quote that I responded to in this essay, remember, I'd probably respond to all 5 of them this time rather than having one particular one there, but it's what I did at the time. So we've got, in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people not to be on the side of executioners. That's by Albert Camus. So you could interpret this in many ways, really. Reading that now kind of makes me think of other ways to interpret it. But at the time, I kind of interpreted it as, you know, the world is full of conflict, violence, and all the other quotes were to do with violence as well. In a world of victims and executioners, so Albert Camus is saying that there are 2 types of people. It's a job of thinking people, that's a keyword, not to be on the side of the executioners. So when you read this, you're kind of like, okay, well, he's saying that it's the job of thinking people not to be on the side of executioners, so you want to be on the side of victims. Yes, I kind of took that as like, I agreed with that somewhat, but then I took it one step further because I said, not only do you not want to be on the side of the executioners, but you want to be a thinking person, you have to act out of love and empathy, and I'll get to my point in a second when I write my thesis. All right, so let's begin. So we'll start with the hook. And I think in this one, I wrote a few sentences that could be classified as the hook. Let's see. So I wrote, the idea that violence begets violence needs to be confronted. Throughout history, this idea has ruled our world of conflict and competition. Life could oftentimes seem to be constituted by an everlasting trail of conflict, war, famine, political unrest, pandemics. How do we make it stop? Okay, so the first sentence you can see is quite short and punchy. You can tell that I'm already going to be confronting violence, the idea that violence begets violence. It kind of captured the reader's attention in the very beginning, and then it went on to discuss the context of that sentence. So I'm saying then throughout history, we've got a world of conflict and competition. That's responding to the prompt as well and giving context to the hook. Then I say life can oftentimes seem to be constituted by an everlasting trail of conflict. That's true, and we can all relate to that. You don't need to know any specific examples to know about that. Then I say war, famine, political unrest, pandemics, how do we make it stop? That sentence is quite a strong one because everyone's obviously experienced political unrest and a pandemic in the last couple of years. So it's also capturing the reader's attention by saying that. Then we say, how do we make it stop? Which is quite informal, but it gets to the point. And there's also my rhetorical question there, which is prompting the reader to ask themselves, how do we make it stop? How do we solve the problem of conflict and violence? Which I'll answer in the next sentence. So I've really set myself up for showing the reader that they're going to be able to understand what I'm talking about because I've used examples that they would be aware of. I've brought in a few different ideas. The hook's there to bring them in. The context is there to explain the hook. Then the rhetorical question is to set up a question for my essay and a question for the reader. All right, so we move on. It's becoming frighteningly clear in the 21st century that the world is in desperate need of a peaceful reform. There you go. I've answered that question. I probably could have gone into more detail with what exactly the peaceful reform is, but I think I'm going through that in the next sentence, which is going to be my thesis. So I would say that sentence is still kind of part of the context. All right, then we go into the thesis, and you don't have to do it this way. I say, in this essay, I will explore the idea that. Instead, you might want to just say the cycle of violence and start it from there. I found that doing that kind of set the reader up to know that I'm about to say my thesis, because I'm about to say exactly what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I say, in this essay, I will explore the idea that the cycle of violence is perpetuated throughout society and argue that overcoming its internal and political change will require the rationality of thinking people, as Albert Camus put it, not to be on the side of executioners. You can see that I'm kind of talking about two ideas with that thesis. So I say I'm talking about that the cycle of violence is perpetuated throughout society. That's the first bit. You can tell that that's going to be my first point. So I'm signposting what my ideas are going to be. Then I say, I'm going to argue that overcoming its internal and political change will require the rationality of thinking people not to be on the side of executioners. Awesome. So I've directly quoted the prompt. You don't necessarily need to do that. I did it and the marker kind of liked it in this case, so you can if you want to. Honestly, instead I actually could have talked about what my actual point is going to be, which we'll get onto it later, but it's actually acting out of love and empathy instead of violence. And I may have missed the mark with just quoting the prompt instead of actually hashing out what my idea was. I go on to state my limitations. I say, although this essay is limited in exploring the biopsychosocial cause and effect of violence, because I don't touch on that and I want them to be aware of that, it suggests an antidote to the latter will be brought upon by the action of thoughtful individuals who choose empathy over violence. Okay, cool. So you can say this sentence in a different way if you want to, but the way I've done it is saying that it's kind of extending on from my thesis to say that I'm suggesting an antidote to violence, and this is what the antidote is: thoughtful individuals choosing empathy instead of violence. Now, I would say that's a fairly strong introduction. It definitely could have some tweaks here and there, but the overall structure is fairly sound. We've got a hook, some context, a thesis, a clear thesis, and then stating my limitations. That's kind of all that really needs to happen in your introduction. You just need to draw the reader in, and then you're about to say what you're saying. There's that classic structure of an essay that's like, say what you're going to say it, and then say it again. So the key thing here is that you just want to signpost your arguments and state your thesis. And I've kind of done that in one go. I probably could have done that a little bit earlier on, so I'm like thesis and then signpost, but that's up to you to change it. But like I said, I wrote this essay pretty early on, so I'll forgive myself in this situation. All right, so onto the body paragraphs. Now, with my body paragraph structure, I would always use the same one. I would go point, example, explanation, counter-argument, and reconfirming my argument, and then finally linking back and forward. I'll explain what that means in a second, but let's get stuck in. All right, so we know in this paragraph that I'm going to be talking about the cycle of violence because that's what I signposted in my introduction. So I'm using basically the simple peel structure that you might have learned in like Year 9 English, and that's all you really need to do, plus chucking in a counter-argument there. So we've got my point. The phrase violence begets violence dates to the writings of the New Testament and describes the cycle of violence that is now widely assessed in the field of psychology. Okay, so we know that I'm going to be discussing the cycle of violence and the fact that violence begets violence. Honestly, reading this now, I might change that a little bit because my point seems to be here that I'm just discussing the cycle of violence, but my actual point is supposed to be that the cycle of violence exists and is highly perpetuated throughout society and throughout history. So let's see what I say next. I say violence is treated as a self-perpetuating cycle, one in which the victim becomes the abuser to subsequently continue the infinite chain. Okay, so I've just explained the cycle of violence there. That's fine, just a bit of context. Then I say, sadly, due to this unrelenting cycle, humanity's history of violence has entwined itself in modern society. Okay, cool. So that's my point there. I probably could have tied that into just one sentence and made that my topic sentence, just saying that Violence begets violence is an idea that dates back to the New Testament. It explains the cycle of violence that we see in psychology today, and it has entwined itself in modern society. 3 points in one sentence, bang, bang, bang. That might have been more succinct. I've kind of taken the long route and explained it in 3 sentences, which is fine, but I probably could have cut it down a little bit. All right, so we go on and we get to my example. I say, the intergenerational cycle of violence, which is what I'm using as my example, is a common presence in the lives of many, wherein children exposed to domestic violence are likely to develop behavioral issues, often to become the abused or the abuser. Now, I didn't even really need to know a perfect example from history or contemporary society to be aware of this. We're all pretty much aware of the intergenerational cycle of violence, but all I've done there, just from either our own experience or things that we've maybe seen on TV or heard in popular culture. And I've used that to come up with a relevant example for this essay, which is fine. So then I elaborate and I say, this happens in schools, friendship circles, and positions of leadership where the bullied becomes the bully. Again, just use that from my own experience in primary school. Then I bring in a contemporary society example. In this case, I've used Michael Jackson. Kind of uncomfortable that I use that, but I probably watched that awful documentary about him the week before or something, so it was present in my mind. I say, one only needs to look so far as Michael Jackson in Hollywood to find ample evidence for this. There you go. I've used an example from my own experience and one from contemporary society, and that's fine. It perfectly explains it. I've kind of been quite subtle with how I'm using the Michael Jackson example in this because I haven't really explained it. I've just kind of assumed that the reader knows what happened to Michael Jackson. It's a good example, but I probably could have explained that a little bit better. But perhaps the subtleness of it is good. Then I say, of course, one could argue that violence is not necessarily always perpetuated. So that's the example and the explanation. Now we'll look at the counter argument and confirm my argument. I say, of course, one could argue that violence is not necessarily always perpetuated and individuals may choose to walk away from it. That's the counter-argument. I've maybe picked the strongest counter-argument, but there probably is another one there. I'm just trying to acknowledge the other point of view saying that the cycle of violence perhaps isn't inevitable, which, yeah, it's a mild counter-argument. I probably could have found a stronger one, but it'll do. Then I go on to reconfirm my argument. Unfortunately, the cycle of violence is not so easy to break. Awesome, so I've acknowledged the counter-argument and I've reconfirmed my argument. Overcoming the cycle of violence will require learning how to act out of a place of love and empathy rather than hate. That last sentence is my linking sentence, and you can see that I've linked back and I've linked forward. I'll show you how. So I've linked back by saying overcoming the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence is the point that I was just talking about. And I'm linking forward by acknowledging my next argument, which is acting out of a place of love and empathy rather than hate. And that really sets me up nicely for going on to my next paragraph, which is why you should link back and then link forward. That's the point of a linking sentence. It encompasses the last point that you just talked about in that paragraph and then looks forward into your next one, because it feels like it's got quite good flow in that way. So I would say that's a pretty good body paragraph. It's not too long, it's not too short. It kind of says everything that I need to say. It uses a solid example, explains it, and then a nice linking sentence. It could be refined a little bit more, sure, but when you're writing a GAMSAT essay, you don't always have heaps of time to edit it. So I would say that's a pretty good attempt. So we'll move on to body paragraph number 2. And for this one, we're using exactly the same structure. Nothing's really changing. Point, example, explanation, counter, and then link. All right, so my topic sentence for this paragraph says, in such a world of conflict, only the rational peacemaker can cease a chain of violence. I would say that one's awesome. That one's way better than the last topic sentence because it kind of gets straight to the point. We don't really know what a rational peacemaker is, but I'm about to say that in the next sentence, so that's fine. And I've also kind of linked back in that sentence because I've said in such a world of conflict, which leads back to my last paragraph. So it has really good flow, just following on from my last paragraph and setting me up to discuss my next point. All right, so I go on to say, with rationality, one may set a new precedent for authority, one that is led by understanding, thought, and empathy. So again, explaining my topic sentence, saying what I'm about to go into, and explaining why I think that the rational peacemaker can cease the chain of violence. And then I explain that with another nice sentence, for the opposite of violence is not simply peace, but love, an active antidote to a hateful act. Nice, so that's kind of like short and punchy, a bit informal, but it really tells the reader what I believe to be true, that solving violence and conflict is going to take love, not just peace, the action of love and being kind and empathetic. And you can play into what you think that they might want to hear from a future doctor. They're probably not going to give a good mark to a doctor who thinks that we should solve violence with more violence. No, they'll give a better mark to a doctor that they think is going to be kind and empathetic and treat people with love and kindness. So feel free to play that up, because you can be anyone that you want in these essays. So try and be the best part of yourself that you think will bring out the qualities in you that will make you a great doctor, because that's what you want to show them. All right, so now I move on to talking about my example. And in this case, you can see I use Martin Luther King Jr. So I say, Martin Luther King Jr. exclaimed in one of his famous speeches, "We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Our aim must be never to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding." Now, I only remembered that quote because I had used it a number of times in many different essays. You don't have to remember specific quotes, rather you can just talk about ideas and about people. But it might also be a nice idea to find a quote from history or society or whatever it is, philosophy, psychology, that you can apply to a number of contexts. Because I know that I use this quote for racism essays, for friendship, understanding essays, conflict, war, protest, a bunch of different things. So if you can find a couple quotes that might fit a bunch of themes, feel free to use them and integrate them in a way that makes sense. All right, then I go on to explain my example. And I say, King was revered for his efforts for refuting racism in the US in the 1960s, not with physical retaliation, but with the aim for reconciliation and rehabilitation through understanding. That's just explaining the quote in another way. And I didn't need to know a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. to say that, but it makes a lot of sense in the context, and it's not false, so that's fine. Then I go on and I further explain the example, and I say, he led and inspired a movement with this attitude, which arguably made one of the greatest steps forward combating racism in the 20th century. That's great. It's showing the amplitude of my argument, saying that if we fight violence and conflict with love and understanding, it can have huge ripple effects on society. Then we can see that I'm going on to my counter argument, because I say, indeed, non-violence can be very difficult in practice, but if violent power is instead retaliated with more violence, this preserves the legacy of the old authority and simply reconfirms the argument that violence begets violence. Cool, so there's a lot in that sentence there. I'm acknowledging the counter argument, which is saying that non-violence can be difficult in practice. It's not so easy in all cases, but I'm saying if we don't respond with love and empathy, and instead we retaliate with more violence, then it's preserving the old legacy of violence begetting violence, and that links back to my first argument. To be honest, I probably could have talked about the other option, which is like walking away from violence and not doing anything and ignoring it, for sure, but I've obviously chosen the route to bring in my old argument. Remember always just to bring in the strongest argument that you can with your counter argument, because then you get the best chance to refute it and confirm your argument. Also with your counter argument, it's a really good opportunity to show empathy and that you can understand multiple points of view, which is again going to be a really important quality for a doctor to have. So make sure you think about that when you're thinking about your counter argument. So now I'm confirming my argument again with another sentence. Seemingly, the only true remedy for a culture of violence is one which does not act against it, but rehabilitates it. So I'm just repeating my argument using slightly different words. Then we go on to my linking sentence and we say, only through empathy, rationality, and the action of thoughtful individuals, that's the linking back, may the culture of violence be undone so that we may move towards a society built upon the values of peace and understanding. That's clearly linking forward into my conclusion and setting me up for a bigger discussion about why it's important to end this culture of violence and act out of empathy and love instead. That was a pretty good body paragraph as well. I would say that's kind of even stronger than my first one, just because the structure's a little bit better and I've targeted my point and my contention a little bit better. The first one just could have been cleaned up a little bit, but the order of them is very good because I'm saying we have this problem and we need to fix it. I did a lot of my argumentative style essays in that fashion, where I would use my first body paragraph to acknowledge the problem and then the second one to acknowledge the solution. If you are going to attack it in that direction, then you need to propose a solution that actually is quite practical. You want to target a practical solution so that you can actually offer up a solution to the problem that you're bringing up. If you don't attack that solution really and develop that idea properly, the problem that you've discussed is still just a problem. You want to show them that you're a problem solver and that you have great ideas about life, society, and show them how you want to lead your life, because again, we're thinking about what they want to hear and what they think would make a good doctor. Okay, so we'll move on to the conclusion now. Finally, with my structure for the conclusion, I always used point, explain, acknowledgement of limitations, importance for society, and then finishing it off with a call to action. So 5 steps. So first of all, with this one, you've got the point at the beginning, which is saying, for a society trapped within a cycle of violence, it must be up to the thinkers of our world to envision a new society. To be a thinker will involve being able to recognize, analyze, and overcome the limits of our own experiences, the trauma of our pasts, and our tendencies towards violent behavior. We've got the point and we've got the explanation. Then I say, then we may stare our nature in the eyes, confront it, and choose to move past it towards a more peaceful route. Awesome. So those 3 sentences are delivering my point and explaining that point. It sounds quite nice as well. I've employed some literary and narrative techniques as well in that by saying we may stare our nature in the eyes. That's something you might not hear in a very formal argumentative essay, so feel free to experiment with styles in this as well. Then I continue to explain and I say, this active approach will require acting out of understanding, empathy, and love, and will refuel these very virtues in return. You can see that I've said it again, what I just said in my argument, by linking back to the cycle of violence and acting out of empathy and love by being a rational thinker. Then I go on to acknowledge the limitations and I say, we do not need to agree on everything, but if we can agree that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and kindness, we will create the space for more meaningful connections with one another. Now, that's fine. I haven't specifically acknowledged the limitations of my point here, but I've said that we don't need to agree on everything. You may disagree with this point. You could definitely go into more detail here and say, you know, opinions will diverge. You probably won't think the same thing that I've just put forward because it's my own perspective, and that's limited, of course, because I'm just one single person with my own opinion. But if we can agree that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and kindness, blah, 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 blah. Now, that's also linking forward quite well into my next point, which is the importance for society bit. And I say, this concept will be incredibly important in the future of our modern connected world and may provide us a framework out of which we may create a welcoming world for all of us. Boom. Like that's really good. That's really big for society, that we are living in a modern connected world and we want to make it welcoming for everyone. No, we don't want to see the world continue going into war, poverty, conflict that are caused by and that we try to solve with violence. It's going to be crucial for us to end the cycle of violence and act instead out of love and empathy, because we don't want a world that is disconnected and fueled by violence. Okay, rant over. Now, I finish it off with a nice little call to action for the individual, and I say, even in our everyday lives, if we choose to neglect our violent urges and instead act out of love, we might start to see some well-needed change for the better. Simple, sweet. It urges the reader to take what they have just read and act in their own lives according to what I suggested. You know, and I think that that's actually the point of these essays, because the scope of your essay, this essay that you're writing for the GAMSAT, isn't the whole world. Not everybody is going to see this essay that you've written. You haven't written it in an online magazine. You're not posting it on YouTube. You're writing it so the marker can feel inspired by you. They're trying to place their trust in you so that ultimately they can place their trust, putting the lives of others in your hands as a doctor. All right, so that's all I've got for you guys today. I really hope that this helped someone out there and that you found value in this. Maybe even just helping you refine your structure a bit, or show you what kind of different tones you can play with. Whatever you got from it, just remember that my one tip is to show your personality and write from the heart. Write about something that you believe in, because it's gonna make it so much easier to write about and way better for the marker to read. Remember that the markers want to get to know you and what you've got, so really bring it in both of your essays. Make sure that as well, keep an eye out next week for my next video about how I write my Task B essays, which I would argue that I write them better than my Task A essays. I'll be going through a practice essay which I scored 87 for, which is an awesome mark. So keep an eye out for that one next week. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you again very soon.
So girls, move it around. If you see your main dog, get the brother a pound and just come on, come on.